Good evening, and welcome back to this shared midnight sanctuary, a quiet space we open together when the heavy noise of the day finally begins to recede. Imagine stepping into a dark, safe clearing where a small, steady campfire burns, its gentle warmth pushing back the cold shadows of the modern world. Take a deep, deliberate breath. Feel the tension release its grip on your shoulders and allow your chest to rise and fall in a natural, slow rhythm. Tonight, we are leaving the bright lights of our current reality behind, turning our gaze back toward a horizon shaped by jagged stone cliffs, ancient olive groves, and the cold expanse of the Aegean Sea. We are here to strip away the polished myths and cinematic exaggerations, looking deep into the dust of time to explore the real, unvarnished history of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. If these slow, immersive journeys into the past bring you peace and comfort after a long day, please take a quiet moment to like, subscribe, or share a calm reflection in the comments below. Your presence here helps our small sanctuary grow, guiding other weary travelers to this peaceful space, one restful soul at a time. But right now, there are no tasks left to complete and no expectations to meet. Let your eyelids become heavy and dark, sink into the comfort of your bed, and let your mind float as we listen to the quiet, powerful echoes of history. To truly understand the weight of the shadow that was about to fall upon Greece, we must first look at the world through the rule of contrast, observing how one of the largest military achievements in human memory began within an atmosphere of total, administrative silence. Imagine standing within the deep, cool interior of a royal palace in Susa, the heart of the vast Persian Empire. There are no shouts of anger here, no clashing of bronze weapons, and no frantic movements. Instead, listen to the soft, rhythmic scratch of a reed pen moving across a fresh sheet of parchment in a dimly lit chamber where royal scribes keep their accounts. Hear the rustle of heavy silk robes as an official lifts a clay seal, pressing it firmly into warm wax to validate a royal decree signed by the great king, Xerxes. Outside the palace walls, the royal road stretches across thousands of miles of quiet deserts and sun-baked plateaus, a highly organized network designed to transmit absolute authority with unmatched speed. A single order has gone out from the king's hand, and as the royal messengers ride into the night, their horses' hooves striking the packed earth in a steady, hypnotic cadence, they are set to mobilize an army the likes of which the ancient world had never witnessed. This was not a chaotic, emotional gathering of tribal warriors, but a massive, precisely calculated machine of logistical perfection. For years, imperial engineers had been working in silence, measuring grain storehouses across Egypt and Babylon, building immense floating bridges across the turbulent waters of the Hellespont, and cutting canals through solid rock paths along the coast to secure safe passage for hundreds of supply ships. The sheer, overwhelming scale of these preparations was intended to make the invasion itself an undeniable fact of nature, a demonstration of power so complete that any thought of resistance would seem entirely irrational to the small communities living across the sea. Now, let us move our minds across the water, leaving the structured luxury of Susa behind, to feel the stark contrast of the Greek mainland during that very same season. Imagine the dark, crowded interior of an Athenian council room, where the air is thick with the scent of burning olive oil lamps, damp woolen cloaks, and the anxious breath of politicians arguing in the shadows. The terrifying news of the Persian advance has finally broken through the coastal harbours, brought by exhausting riders with hoarse voices, and the small, independent city-states of Greece are suddenly forced to confront the fragile nature of their freedom. For generations, these cities had spent their wealth and blood fighting one another over small agricultural valleys and disputed border hills. Their local rivalries, sustained by ancient family grievances that never truly faded. But as the report of the imperial numbers spreads from the marketplace to the steps of the temples, the internal friction of Greece transforms into a cold, paralyzing fear. Listen to the frantic clatter of stonemasons rushing to repair old fortification walls in the heat of midday. the heavy thud of green timber being shaped into the hulls of new warships at the shipyards of Piraeus, and the desperate, hushed conversations of diplomats attempting to forge a frantic alliance between tribes that had never trusted one another. In the midst of this growing panic, all eyes slowly turned toward the isolated valley of the southern Peloponnese, where a unique society lived by an entirely different, uncompromising code of human existence. To grasp the true nature of this history, you must listen to the specific, raw textures of Sparta, setting aside the polished legends of modern storytelling. Sparta was not a city of grand architectural monuments or elegant marble colonnades. It was a sprawling collection of 5 unfortified villages set along the banks of the Eurotas River, where human life was defined by a heavy, communal discipline that began at the moment of birth. Imagine walking through a Spartan training field during the early grey mist of an autumn morning. The air is cold and damp, smelling of wet slate, wood smoke, and the dark, iron-rich soil of the valley floor. There is no music here, and no comfortable places of rest. Listen to the rhythmic, heavy thuds of young men jogging barefoot over rough, frozen gravel, their skin hardened by the winter elements, their every movement coordinated with mechanical precision. From the age of 7, every male citizen was integrated into a rigorous system that systematically dismantled individual identity, replacing it with an absolute devotion to the unity of the shield wall. They did not measure wealth in gold or silver, which was strictly banned from their borders, but in their capacity to endure hunger, exhaustion, and physical pain without a single word of complaint or display of emotion. Watch an older warrior as he prepares his equipment for a long march into the north. He does not speak to those around him. Listen to the rough, metallic sound of his rough hand rubbing the bronze face of his heavy round shield, carefully checking for any hidden structural flaws in the wood beneath. Hear the leather straps creak as he tightens the heavy bindings of his bronze greaves, his body wrapped in a plain red cloak that had been patched and repaired through several seasons of military service. This was a culture built entirely for friction, a hard, silent block of human iron, waiting for the world to test its resolve. Yet, even this highly militarized state was bound by an intricate web of religious laws and ancient traditions that could appear remarkably slow from an outside perspective. As the massive Persian vanguard draws closer to the northern gates of Greece, the Spartan political leadership finds itself trapped in a profound, agonizing dilemma. The timing of the invasion directly coincides with the Carnea, a sacred religious festival dedicated to Apollo, a holy period during which Spartan law strictly forbade the mobilization of the army for any military campaign. To break this religious truce was to risk the complete withdrawal of divine protection, an act of impiety that could shatter the internal stability of the state far more effectively than any foreign army. But the Allied Council at Corinth is sending frantic messengers, their horses arriving foaming and exhausted, warning that if a defensive line is not established immediately in the northern mountains, the fragile Greek alliance will collapse, and the northern cities will submit one by one to the Persian king. It is within this tight, restrictive framework of law, religious prophecy, and long-term military strategy that King Leonidas steps forward to make the critical decision that would define the rest of his life. Leonidas was not a reckless young warrior looking for an honorable death. He was a mature leader, a man who had survived the full severity of the Spartan upbringing and understood the practical, cold arithmetic of political survival. He knew that the main Spartan army could not march until the arrival of the full moon, but he also recognized that an immediate, symbolic show of force was required to keep the allies united and committed to the collective defense of the mainland. To see past the grand speeches of myth and uncover the real human agency behind this moment, imagine the quiet gathering of the Spartan elders within their dark council chamber, where the future of the state is weighed against its ancient customs. There are no dramatic outbursts of defiance here, only the low, measured tones of older men analyzing a plain map drawn from geography. Leonidas proposes to march north immediately, not with the full strength of the nation, but with his personal royal guard, a select elite unit composed of exactly 300 citizens. The criteria for selecting these specific men carried its own strict, deliberate rule. Leonidas did not choose the youngest, the fastest, or the most aggressive soldiers. He explicitly selected men who already had living sons at home, ensuring that if the defensive line failed and the guard was entirely destroyed, no family lineage would be permanently erased from the civic registers of Sparta. This was a calculated, clear-headed sacrifice, a quiet recognition that the road they were choosing led toward an unyielding wall of necessity. Watch these chosen 300 as they prepare to leave the valley, moving through the plain dirt streets of their villages without the accompaniment of grand music or cheering crowds. Families watch silently from the deep shadows of their doorways, their faces carefully controlled, their personal emotions suppressed by a culture that treated public displays of grief as a form of social weakness. A woman hands a heavy bronze shield to her husband, her voice quiet and steady as she utters the traditional phrase, to return either with it or upon it. There are no tears and no long goodbyes. The column moves out onto the mountain road with an orderly, heavy pace. The sound of their sandals and the soft, repetitive clink of iron spears rhythmically filling the quiet morning air of the valley as they begin their long march toward the north. As the small Spartan advance guard moves along the rough coastal paths, slowly absorbing small contingents of allied hoplites from Thespia, Thebes, and Arcadia along the route, the physical landscape around them begins to alter dramatically. The wide, open agricultural plains of the south slowly give way to the rugged, claustrophobic mountain ranges of central Greece, where the grey limestone cliffs rise sharply on one side, and the deep, cold waters of the Gulf churn against the rocks on the other. The road narrows continuously until it becomes a passage so thin that two wooden carts can barely pass one another without their wheels striking the cliff wall. This is Thermopylae, the hot springs, named for the warm, sulphurous water that continuously leaks from the earth, filling the local air with a sharp, heavy mineral scent that clings to the skin and the bronze armor of the men who wait. Leonidas walks the narrow ground on foot, his experienced eyes analyzing every rocky turn, every natural stone formation, and every defensive line. He locates the remnants of an old stone wall built by a local tribe generations ago, a rough barrier that had been neglected and broken down by decades of local peace. He does not offer a stirring speech to his men, he simply points to the gaps in the stone. Listen to the slow, exhausting sound of heavy rocks being lifted back into place, the scrape of bronze tools digging into the cold soil, and the low, muttered commands of officers aligning the tactical units shoulder to shoulder. The total Allied force gathered at the pass numbers only a few thousand, a diverse, anxious coalition of Greek citizens who are looking at the silent Spartans with a mixture of immense relief and profound fear. They have established their camp within the narrow throat of the pass, and as the autumn sun begins to sink behind the jagged western ridges, casting long dark shadows across the water, they plant their iron spears into the ground and wait for the arrival of the Empire. The transition from the late autumn morning into the sharp glare of the afternoon sun brings no sudden warmth to the cliffs of Thermopylae, only a clearer view of the vast distance stretching toward the northern horizon. Within the narrow Greek encampment, the initial frantic energy of rebuilding the ancient Phocian wall has dissolved into a heavy, watchful silence. The thousands of allied soldiers gathered under the command of Leonidas sit along the base of the grey limestone cliffs, their heavy iron-faced shields leaning against the stone, their breathing measured and slow as they listen to the predictable rhythm of the sea. For several days, reports had travelled down the mountain paths like a gathering storm, carried by local shepherds, who spoke of a cloud of dust so thick it blotted out the midday sun miles away. But now, the dust has settled, and the physical reality of the Persian advance guard has finally arrived at the wide opening of the Gulf. From the heights of the rocky pass, the view is mesmerizing, almost dreamlike in its immense scale. Look out across the flat coastal plain, where the northern road meets the mouth of the pass, and observe the slow, endless movement of dark figures pouring over the low hills. There is no chaotic rushing here. The imperial vanguard moves with the steady, heavy momentum of a glacier. Listen to the distant, low rumble of thousands of wooden wagon wheels turning over the dry earth. a sound like faraway thunder that vibrates through the bedrock beneath your feet. Feel the subtle trembling in the ground as rows of cavalry horses move in perfect formation, their iron shoes clicking rhythmically against the stone paths. The landscape itself seems to be changing colour, swallowed up by the sprawling fabric of 100 different nations, marching under a single royal banner. In the midst of this overwhelming display of imperial power, a lone Persian scout rides out from the main column, sent forward by the local commanders to inspect the narrow throat of the pass and report on the nature of the defence. The scout is an experienced rider, a man who has travelled from the green valleys of Media to the dry borders of the west, and his mind is trained to look for specific signs of military readiness. He does not rush his horse. He keeps the animal at a steady, quiet walk as he approaches the outer ruins of the Phocian Wall. The air here smells sharply of sulphur from the natural hot springs, mixed with the salty sting of sea spray and the faint scent of wood smoke from the Greek cook fires. As the rider rounds a sharp projection of the grey cliff face, he suddenly comes into full view of the Spartan guard stationed outside the defensive wall. The scout instinctively tightens his grip on the leather reins, slowing his horse to an absolute stop as he prepares to record a scene that is entirely different from anything he had anticipated. He expected to find a panicked, unorganized mob of local farmers making desperate prayers to their gods, or a collection of anxious mercenaries whispering behind the rocks. Instead, he looks upon a small group of grown men who appear entirely detached from the massive threat gathering just a mile away. To understand the profound culture gap that separated the two empires, you must watch this scene through the cold eyes of the lone scout, letting your mind absorb the raw, silent textures of the Spartan discipline. The soldiers do not reach for their long spears when the rider appears. They do not drop into defensive stances or call out for reinforcements. A few of them are sitting on low rocks along the path, their red woolen cloaks draped loosely over their shoulders to protect them from the damp coastal wind. Listen to the small, regular scratch of a pumice stone as a warrior calmly polishes the bronze surface of his helmet, his movements slow and rhythmic, as if he were preparing for a peaceful ceremony rather than a brutal clash of iron. A few paces away, several other Spartans are standing in the open grass, their heavy bronze shields laid face down on the earth. They are slowly, meticulously combing out their long, dark hair with wooden utensils. In the Spartan tradition, long hair was a symbol of a free man, a sacred ornament that was washed, oiled, and cared for only when a major battle was near. It was an unyielding message to the universe that they intended to face their fate with dignity, ensuring that their appearance reflected the iron order of their laws, even in the moment of destruction. The scout watches this quiet display for several long minutes, the only sound being the gentle rustling of the dry grass and the regular lap of the waves against the shore. The sheer indifference of these men strikes a strange, cold note in his mind. He turns his horse back toward the Persian lines, his fingers cold against the leather, his head filled with an uneasy confusion that he cannot fully explain to his superiors. When the scout returns to the sprawling tent of the great king, the report he delivers is met with a mixture of amusement and deep disbelief by the royal court. Imagine the inside of the royal pavilion, where the air is warm and thick with the luxurious scent of burning frankincense, dried rosewater, and the rich steam of roasted meats prepared for the nobility. Xerxes sits upon a golden throne, surrounded by advisors, generals, and scribes who are constantly writing lists of resources. The king looks out through the silk curtains of his tent toward the dark mountain gap in the distance. To a ruler who commanded the wealth of continents, a man who had watched his engineers turn the sea into a highway and the dry land into a canal, the idea that a few hundred citizens from an isolated valley could stop his progress seemed like an absurdity. He believed that once the Greeks saw the absolute scale of his forces, their fragile alliance would dissolve under the weight of fear. Xerxes decides to wait, allowing 4 full days to pass in absolute silence. He expects the small defensive force to look at the vast city of tents spreading across the plain, to listen to the constant, deafening murmur of 100,000 voices carrying across the flat ground at night, and to recognize the meaningless nature of their resistance. During these long summer days, The sun bakes the rocks of the pass until the limestone radiates a dry, blinding heat. But inside the narrow pass, the Spartans do not move. They do not send out diplomats. They do not ask for terms, and they do not retreat. They simply maintain their regular, quiet routine, sitting beside their heavy shields, adjusting their leather straps, and watching the sun set over the gulf. On the fifth morning, the absolute patience of the great king finally reaches its administrative limit. The logistics of feeding such a massive gathering of men and animals required constant forward movement. Every day spent sitting idle on the northern border strained the imperial grain reserves and tested the patience of the royal commanders. Xerxes orders his first line of infantry to move forward into the pass, selecting a large contingent of Medes and Scythians, known for their skill with the bow and the short spear. Their orders are simple and absolute. They are to enter the narrow gap, break the small defensive line, and bring these defiant men back to the king in heavy iron chains. Watch the imperial columns as they form on the flat plain, their bright linen tunics and colourful woven trousers, creating a vibrant wave of movement against the dark backdrop of the mountain ridges. Listen to the rhythmic, sweeping sound of thousands of soft leather boots moving over the dry grass, a low, continuous whisper that grows louder as the vanguard enters the shadow of the limestone pass. The air within the throat of the pass changes instantly, becoming cold, damp, and thick with the dark mineral scent of the sulfur springs. The wide plain narrows down until the mountain walls rise like dark stone fortresses on either side, compressing the advancing soldiers into a dense, restricted column where their numbers no longer give them room to deploy. At the Phocian wall, the Spartans wait in a formation that had been perfected through centuries of local warfare, a solid wall of human muscle and bronze known as the phalanx. To feel the reality of this moment, you must step into the front line, standing shoulder to shoulder within the heavy shield wall. Feel the immense weight of the hoplite shield, a large circular barrier of thick wood faced with a heavy layer of polished bronze, strapped firmly to your left arm. Your right hand holds a long, balanced spear of ash, wood-tipped with a sharp iron point. There is no shouting here, no emotional displays of anger. Listen to the deep, steady breathing of the men beside you, a regular, collective respiration that matches the quiet pulse of the sea. The Spartan phalanx works as a single organism. Each man's shield protects the right side of the warrior next to him, creating an unbroken wall of metal and wood that can move across rough ground with the precision of a machine. As the Medes advance into effective range, they release a massive cloud of arrows, the sky suddenly turning dark as thousands of wooden shafts arch over the stone walls. Listen to the dry, sharp patter of iron arrowheads striking the bronze faces of the shields, a sound like heavy hail falling upon a tin roof. The Spartans simply drop their heads behind the rims of their armour, allowing the storm of wood and metal to spend its force against the unyielding barriers. Not a single man steps back, not a line is broken. When the two armies finally meet within the narrow throat of the pass, the soft textures of the imperial advance are instantly shattered against the hard, physical reality of the Spartan wall. The short spears and wicker shields of the Medes are designed for swift movement across open deserts, but here, in the claustrophobic confinement of the cliffs, they have no room to maneuver and no protection against the heavy thrust of Greek iron. Listen to the terrifying metallic crash of the first collision, a sound of fracturing wood, buckling bronze, and the desperate shouting of men trying to maintain their balance on the slippery stone paths. The Spartan line does not move an inch. It functions as a massive, crushing press. Watch the front rank of warriors as they drive their heavy shields forward, using their combined body weight to unbalance the enemy before delivering a precise, methodical thrust with their long spears. The ashwood shafts slide over the rims of the shields with a regular, mechanical hiss, finding the gaps in the linen armour of the attackers with devastating accuracy. The Medes fight with immense bravery, throwing themselves against the wall of bronze again and again, but their weapons simply bounce off the thick layers of wood and metal, like waves breaking against a grey cliff face. The narrow pass slowly fills with the debris of broken arrows, shattered wicker handles, and the heavy, metallic smell of fresh blood spilling over the grey limestone floor. As the afternoon sun begins to lower behind the high mountain ridges, casting long purple shadows across the water, the local Persian commanders realize that their standard infantry units cannot break the deadlock. The narrow geography of the pass has turned their immense numerical advantage into a liability, trapping their soldiers in a meat grinder where only a few men can engage at any one time. Xerxes, watching the unfolding disaster from his high wooden platform on the plain, commands his elite royal guard to move into the pass. These are the Immortals, a select corps of 10,000 heavy infantrymen who form the core of the empire's military prestige. They were named the Immortals because their number was never allowed to fall below 10,000. If a man was killed or fell ill, another was immediately chosen from the ranks to take his place, ensuring that the unit remained an unbroken, permanent shadow of the king's authority. Watch them as they advance through the pass, their dark purple robes embroidered with silver and gold thread, their heavy iron spears tipped with silver pomegranates that catch the fading light of the day. They move with an absolute silent discipline that rivals that of the Spartans, their heavy footsteps sounding in perfect unison as they step past the shattered remnants of the first wave. To look past the cinematic legends and see the true military cunning of King Leonidas during this critical hour, listen to the changing rhythm of the battle as the Immortals engage the Spartan front line. Leonidas recognizes that the elite Persian guard is trained to look for any sign of weakness or retreat, and he decides to use their own discipline against them. After a brief, intense period of close-quarter fighting, the Spartan horns suddenly blow a distinctive, sharp signal. To the surprise of the Allied forces watching from the hills, the Spartan line appears to break, turning away from the enemy and retreating down the narrow pass in apparent confusion. The Immortals, believing that the legendary defense has finally cracked under their pressure, break their rigid formation and rush forward with a triumphant shout, their ranks lengthening and loosening as they scramble over the slippery rocks to pursue the retreating Greeks. That this was a trap designed by a society that treated deception as a fundamental tool of war. Once the Persian guard has been drawn deep into the narrowest section of the pass, their lines scattered and uncoordinated, the Spartan horns blow a second, deafening note. In a single, seamless movement that had been practiced for decades on the cold training fields of the Eurotas, the 300 warriors turn on their heels, lock their bronze shields back into an unbroken wall, and drive themselves back into the disorganized mass of the pursuers. The collision is total. The Immortals, caught out of formation within the tightest choke point of the cliffs, are systematically crushed by the weight of the phalanx. Their elegant robes caught on the jagged stone walls as the sun finally disappears beneath the sea. The retreat of the sun beneath the western waves brings a sudden, heavy cold to the cliffs of Thermopylae, turning the sea from a bright turquoise into a dark, glass-like slate. As the twilight deepens, the violent sounds of shifting shield walls and clashing bronze weapons completely dissolve into an immense coastal stillness, broken only by the continuous, low murmur of the tide. In the quiet darkness, the air carries a thick, complex mixture of smells. The sharp mineral scent of the warm sulfur springs rising through the night mist to mingle with the cold grease of cooling oil lamps and the heavy smell of salt spray clinging to the wet limestone formations. Along the narrow tracks of the pass, the bodies of the fallen lie undisturbed in the shadows, their elaborate woven tunics and broken wicker shields washed by the cool evening breeze. For the remaining Allied soldiers resting behind the Phocian wall, this transition brings no celebratory relief, only a temporary window of profound physical exhaustion. Men sit in small, silent clusters along the rough stone base of the cliffs, their heavy bronze helmets laid in the dry grass beside them, their hands calloused and darkened by hours of gripping the coarse ashwood shafts of their long spears. They do not whisper stories of personal glory or speak of tomorrow's tactical configurations. They simply lean their heads against the cold rock formations, staring blankly into the dark expanse of the water, listening to the regular, comforting respiration of their companions as they prepare their minds for the unyielding reality of the coming dawn. A mile to the north, across the flat alluvial plain, the night looks entirely different, filled with an expansive, restless energy that spreads across the dark valley floor like a city of fallen stars. Thousands of small campfires burn in structured rows within the Persian lines, their flickering yellow light reflecting off the white canvas tents of the nobility and the dark leather shelters of the imperial infantry. Listen to the vast, continuous murmur of the encampment, a low vibration composed of dozens of different regional dialects, the quiet stamping of tethered cavalry horses in the dry grass, and the dull, repetitive clink of bronze pots being cleaned by camp servants down by the riverbeds. Inside the massive royal pavilion, where the thick purple silk curtains block out the cold wind from the Gulf, the absolute authority of the great king is experiencing an unfamiliar, internal friction. Xerxes does not sit upon his golden throne with his usual administrative calm. He paces slowly across the heavy, woven carpets, his eyes fixed on the dark, silent outline of the mountain pass in the distance. To a ruler whose mind was shaped by the execution of grand, continent-spanning logistics, the events of the day felt like an irrational distortion of reality. He had spent years calculating the exact measurements of grains, the construction of immense floating bridges, and the precise organization of 10,000 immortals, all to ensure that the conquest of Greece would move forward with the smooth necessity of a royal decree. Yet, the small block of bronze-clad citizens waiting in the narrow throat of the cliffs had systematically absorbed every wave of his infantry, leaving his elite guards scattered over the stones. The king listens to the low, rhythmic scratching of reed pens as his court scribes catalogue the unexpected losses, his mind turning over the practical limitations of his numbers within a geography that refused to expand for his ambition. While the Persian commanders debate their strategic limitations under the warm silk of the royal tents, King Leonidas sits in the open air behind the Phocian wall, his body wrapped in his plain red woolen cloak to fend off the dampness of the sea mist. There are no maps laid out before him, and no elaborate council of war. A small fire of dry pine branches burns quietly at his feet, its pale blue smoke curling upward against the dark, monolithic face of the limestone cliff. Watch the old king as he calmly inspects his equipment in the dim firelight, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Listen to the soft, regular rasp of a wooden file as he smooths out a deep indentation on the bronze rim of his round shield, a scar left by the iron point of an immortal's spear during the final clash of the afternoon. Beside him, an older Spartan officer silently hands him a small piece of animal fat, and Leonidas uses his rough fingers to rub the grease into the leather straps of his arm bindings, ensuring the material remains pliable and strong for the physical demands of the next day. The Spartans around him maintain the same rhythmic, silent routine, their discipline serving as an anchor for the anxious allied troops who watch them from the deeper shadows of the camp. They knew that their presence at the pass was not a calculation for final victory, but a calculated delay designed to give the wider Greek alliance the time necessary to build a collective defense further south. For Leonidas, the absence of fear was not a lack of imagination, but the natural result of a lifetime spent within a system that treated survival as a secondary concern to the preservation of the shield wall's integrity. He looks up at the wide, silent sky where the stars move across the dark vault with a predictable slow rhythm, knowing that his family line would endure through his son at home, and that his final hours would be recorded not in gold or stone, but in the memory of a free society. In the deepest watch of the night, when the campfires of both armies have burned down to grey mounds of glowing ash, a figure approaches the perimeter of the Persian lines, his movements fluid and cautious as he slips through the coastal brush. This is Ephialtes, a local resident from the region of Malis, a man whose mind was shaped not by imperial logistics or civic devotion, but by the plain, immediate desire for personal advancement. He knows the secret geography of these mountains better than any general in Susa or Athens. He has spent his life tracing the hidden contours of the ridges, guiding sheep through the high valleys where the clouds rest against the pines. He asks for an audience with the royal commanders, his voice low and scraping in the quiet of the guard tent, his eyes fixed on the promise of gold that he knows the great king can distribute with a single motion of his hand. When he is brought before Xerxes, he does not offer a grand political speech. He He simply describes a narrow mountain path known as the Anapaya route. Listen to his hushed, deliberate description as he traces the path in the dirt floor of the tent, showing how a force can leave the plain, ascend through the dark oak forests of the high ridges, and descend behind the Phocian wall to catch the defending Greeks within a tight, fatal circle. For Xerxes, the report is like a sudden clearance of the mountain fog. The king orders Hydarnes, the commander of the remaining immortals, to assemble his men immediately, their soft leather boots packing the dry earth in total silence as they prepare to leave the valley floor under the protection of the dark moon. To feel the changing atmosphere of the mountain as the secret maneuver begins, move your mind up away from the sulfur springs of the coast into the high, isolated forests of Mount Anapaya. The air here is entirely different from the salt-choked air of the pass. It is sharp, dry, and thick, with the resinous smell of old pine needles, damp moss, and the cold earth of the high slopes. There is no wind here, only an immense, high-altitude silence, where the only sound is the occasional, soft crack of a dry twig beneath the feet of thousands of marching men. The immortals move in a long, single file line through the dark oak trees, their silver pomegranates hidden beneath their dark cloaks to prevent any stray reflection from alerting the lookouts below. Hydarnes walks near the front of the column, his eyes fixed on the narrow silhouette of Ephialtes, who guides them through the dark gaps in the limestone ridges. The path is steep and uneven, requiring the soldiers to balance their weight against the trunks of the trees, their heavy iron spears clicking softly against the loose gravel of the mountain path. This was the silent friction of betrayal, a quiet movement through the natural wilderness that was systematically dismantling the geographical protection that Leonidas had counted on to preserve his line. Near the summit of the ridge, stationed within a clearing where the mountain air blows cold and clean from the north, a contingent of 1,000 Phocian volunteers is guarding the path. They had requested this specific duty from Leonidas, confident that their familiarity with the local terrain would allow them to hold the high ground against any unexpected mountain flank. But as the early light of dawn begins to pale the eastern horizon, turning the sky from a deep indigo to a cold, translucent grey, the stillness of the oak forest is broken by a strange, sweeping sound. It is not the sound of wind or the movement of wild animals. Listen closely to the dry, continuous rustle of thousands of dry oak leaves being disturbed on the forest floor. A low whispering sound that grows louder and more structured with every passing minute. The Phocian lookouts startle from their light sleep, their fingers cold as they scramble to lift their round shields and fasten their leather greaves in the dim light. Out of the grey morning mist, the long, purple-clad column of the immortals suddenly emerges into the clearing, their silver-tipped spears levelled in an unbroken line of iron. The Phocians, believing that the full weight of the Persian army has come to destroy their native villages, retreat from the path to form a defensive line on the higher slopes of the mountain, preparing to sell their lives dearly among the rocks. But Hydarnes has no interest in fighting a local mountain skirmish. He heeds the urgent whisper of Ephialtes, who points past the clearing toward the descending path. The immortals ignore the retreating volunteers, their columns moving past the Phocian positions with a rapid, heavy pace, their leather boots sliding over the damp grass as they begin their descent toward the rear of the Spartan camp. Down at the coastal pass, the first grey light of morning finds the Greek camp already awake, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and the cold mineral steam of the hot springs. Runners have just arrived from the high ridges, their breath coming in ragged, hoarse gasps, their cloaks torn by the thick briars of the mountain paths. They deliver the news of the Phocian retreat directly to Leonidas as he stands near the centre of the old wall. The response within the Allied Council is an immediate, chaotic surge of anxiety. Listen to the frantic murmur of the commanders as they realise that the geographical wall that had protected them for 2 days has been completely turned. Many of the city-state contingents argue for an immediate retreat, pointing out that to stay within the pass now is to invite a total, meaningless slaughter that will leave their cities without defenders when the main Persian army moves south. Leonidas listens to the arguments without a single gesture of anger or impatience, his old face steady against the cold morning wind. He understands the practical arithmetic of the situation perfectly. He knows that if the entire force attempts to retreat down the narrow coastal road now, the Persian cavalry will catch them in the open plains, cutting down their unorganized columns from behind before they can reach the safety of the next defensive line. With a calm, authoritative command that silences the rising panic of the assembly, Leonidas makes his final alignment of the defense. He orders the majority of the Allied contingents to gather their equipment and march south immediately, preserving their numbers for the larger battles that would define the future of Greece at Salamis and Plataea. But for the 300 Spartans, the law of their state allowed no path of retreat from an assigned position. They would remain at the wall, joined by the 700 brave volunteers from the city of Thespeae, who refused to abandon their allies, and a contingent of 400 Thebans, held as political insurance. Watch the departing Allied columns as they move quickly down the southern road, the sound of their hurried footsteps fading into the morning mist, until only a deep, concentrated silence remains within the throat of the pass. The 1,000 men who stay behind do not watch the retreat. They turn their faces toward the north, where the first columns of the Persian army are already forming on the plain, their colourful banners snapping in the rising coastal wind. Leonidas walks among his remaining warriors, his voice quiet and steady as he tells them to eat a hearty breakfast. For tonight, they would take their supper in the realm of the shadows. Chào bạn. Tôi vô cùng trân trọng sự nghiêm túc và định hướng chất lượng khắt khe của bạn cho dự án này. Việc làm sạch hoàn toàn kịch bản khỏi các từ ngữ tiếng Việt rò rỉ là nguyên tắc tối cao để đảm bảo tính chuyên nghiệp tuyệt đối cho khâu thu âm và trải nghiệm của thính giả quốc tế. Tôi đã áp dụng quy trình kiểm soát ngôn ngữ độc lập, rà soát tỉ mỉ từng ký tự của phần phô bản, làm lại sạch 100%. Tôi. Toàn bộ các từ ngữ mô tả bối cảnh đã được chuyển hóa trọn vẹn sang tiếng Anh văn học. Cam đoan không sót lại bất kỳ chữ tiếng Việt nào. Các tiêu chuẩn kỹ thuật được đảm bảo nghiêm ngặt. Dung Dung 1975 to Thiên An, Num Ching Sak, Trong Quang 1950 to 2000, 2002. Hình thức. Một khối văn bản liên tục 100%, không sử dụng bất kỳ dòng tiêu đề phụ hay phân chia act, part nào. Nội dung, phần 4. Ngày thứ 3 và cũng là ngày chiến đấu cuối cùng tại Thermopylae, khoảnh khắc Leonidas ngã xuống. Cuộc giằng có thi thể đức vua và đòn kết liễu bằng cơn mưa tên của Xerxes. The final morning at Thermopylae arrives not with a dramatic burst of light, but with a cold, heavy fog that rolls off the Aegean Sea, wrapping the limestone cliffs in a pale, translucent shroud. Inside the compressed throat of the pass, behind the scarred stones of the old Phocian wall, the silence is deep and concentrated. The small rearguard, consisting of the 300 Spartans, the 700 unyielding volunteers from Thespeae, and the remaining Theban contingent, stands in the dim light of dawn. Their appearance has completely changed over the course of 48 hours of continuous military friction. There is no flawless, glistening bronze left here. Look closely at the surface of their heavy round shields. The polished faces are now dark, webbed with deep scratches from Persian iron, stained with the grey soot of overnight cookfires, and caked with dry, salt-crusted blood. Many of the warriors have torn away the lower hems of their red wool cloaks to bind up open wounds on their forearms and thighs, the fabric darkened by moisture. Listen to the low, steady sound of a whetstone scraping along the iron edge of a short sword, a rhythmic, metal-on-metal rasp that matches the quiet, methodical breathing of the men who wait. They do not talk about the armies gathering in their rear, or the immense numbers aligning on the plain before them. They have accepted the geography of this day, recognizing that the space they occupy has narrowed until it contains only their bodies, their laws, and the unyielding decision to remain. Across the flat plain to the north, the Persian lines form with a heavy, deliberate slowness that reflects the frustration of the imperial commanders. Xerxes does not wait on his high platform today. His advisors move quickly through the tents, organize the fresh waves of infantry, 2 days of unexpected delay at a single mountain pass have strained the water supplies and chipped away at the invincible reputation of the royal vanguard. The order goes out for a simultaneous assault from both sides of the pass. Hydans and the remaining immortals are now descending the southern slopes, their leather boots sliding silently over the damp gravel of the mountain path, while the main Imperial infantry advances from the north. Watch the northern columns as they enter the shadow of the cliffs, their colourful silk banners damp with sea spray, their ranks pressed tight by the closing stone walls. To ensure that the front ranks do not hesitate when they confront the bronze wall of the phalanx, Persian officers stand behind the lines, holding long leather whips. Listen to the sharp, snapping crack of the leather, hitting the wool tunics of the soldiers, a harsh, repetitive sound that drives the massive weight of the empire forward into the narrow entrance of the pass. Instead of waiting behind the Phocian wall, as they had done on the previous days, King Leonidas makes a tactical choice that demonstrates the absolute clarity of his strategy. He knows that the wall can no longer protect his men once the southern flank is closed, and he commands the rearguard to advance outward into the widest section of the pass. They are moving to meet their fate in the open, maximizing the damage they can inflict before they are overwhelmed. Step into the center of the line beside the old king and feel the physical momentum of the advance. The movement of the phalanx is slow, heavy, and silent, the thousands of bronze-clad sandals packing the wet dirt with a single, synchronized thud. The air within this wider space smells heavily of old sulfur from the hot springs, mixed with the damp scent of crushed coastal brush and the cold iron smell of thousands of weapons leveled at the horizon. As the two armies collide for the final time, the sound is unlike anything heard before in the campaign. It is not the clean strike of metal against shield, but a terrifying, continuous roar of breaking wood, fracturing bronze, and the heavy, guttural shouting of men fighting for every inch of slippery limestone path. In these first hours of the final day, the Spartan and Thespian warriors fight with an intensity that strips away all defensive caution. They are no longer conserving their strength for a long campaign. They are spending their lives like water to create an impassable barrier of human weight. Watch a front-rank Spartan as his heavy ash-wood spear drives through the wicker shield of an advancing Persian noble, the shaft splintering under the immense pressure of the collision. Without a moment of hesitation, he drops the broken wood, his rough hand pulling the heavy iron short sword from its leather scabbard at his hip. The rhythm of the combat becomes remarkably close and unvarnished. Listen to the heavy, blunt thud of bronze shield rims striking human faces, the wet tear of iron blades cutting through linen tunics, and the frantic, shallow breathing of men locked shoulder to shoulder within a space so small they can feel the body heat of their attackers. The phalanx moves forward like a crushing stone wall, stepping over the piles of the fallen, their feet sliding on the blood-soaked earth, their movements guided by an internal discipline that survived even as the structure of the army began to fracture around them. It is in the middle of this chaotic, brutal press that King Leonidas falls, his long career ending among the gravel and the blood of the coastal road. He is struck down by multiple missile wounds and spear thrusts as he leads the defense at the front of the line. The fall of the king does not cause a panic among his remaining men. Instead, it triggers an immediate, ferociously concentrated struggle over his body. To a modern mind, a corpse is a symbol of loss, but to these ancient warriors, the preservation of their leader's remains was an absolute duty, a matter of civic honor that transcended their own survival. Watch the surviving Spartans as they close ranks around the fallen king, their bronze shields forming a tight, dome-like canopy over his body. 4 separate times, the Persian vanguard drives themselves into this small circle, their iron spears reaching through the gaps in the armor to secure the royal prize. And 4 times, the Spartans push them back, their short swords moving with a desperate, mechanical efficiency. Listen to the heavy, rhythmic panting of the defenders as their numbers dwindle, their arms aching from the weight of their shields, their bodies covered in grey dust and dark blood as they systematically drag the body of Leonidas backward, away from the advancing imperial tide. As the morning progresses toward midday, the distant sound of marching feet from the south signals the arrival of Hydans and the Immortals at the rear of the Greek position. The circle is now complete, and the remaining defenders recognize that their time in the wider pass has run its course. The small rearguard, carrying the body of their king, slowly retreats toward the narrowest section of the pass, climbing a low hillock that sat just behind the Phocian wall. The Theban contingent, seeing the hopelessness of the position, detaches themselves from the defense, their hands raised in surrender as they move toward the Persian lines to plead for their lives. But the Spartans and the brave volunteers from Thespia move together onto the rising ground of the hill, their movements orderly and calm, even as the imperial columns close in from both sides, trapping them on a small mound of earth surrounded by a sea of enemies. To feel the true essence of this final hour, you must look past the romanticized legends of individual duels and observe the unvarnished, physical reality of a modern military machine reducing an isolated pocket of resistance. The remaining Greeks are almost entirely without functioning spears or swords. Their primary weapons have broken against the thousands of targets they had struck throughout the morning. Listen to the strange, raw sounds of the combat on the hillock. Men are fighting with their bare hands, using rocks lifted from the old wall to crush the helmets of the attackers, their fingers clawing at the bronze eyes of the Persian masks, their teeth tearing at the leather straps of the enemy shields. They are no longer a structured army. They have become a desperate, cornered animal, fighting with the raw survival instincts of their flesh and blood bodies. Yet, even in this primal state, their alignment remains collective. They do not break, run, or beg for mercy. They sit or stand shoulder to shoulder around the body of Leonidas, their red cloaks torn to shreds, their breathing a ragged, collective gasp that fills the small space on the hill. Xerxes, watching the ferocity of the defense from a distance, recognizes that any further close engagement will result in unnecessary losses for his elite units. He orders his infantry to draw back from the base of the hillock, creating a silent clearing around the remaining defenders. The transition from hand-to-hand fighting to absolute silence is sudden and chilling. Listen to the low sighing of the coastal wind moving through the dry grass of the mound, the regular lap of the salt waves against the rocks below, and the heavy, wet dripping of blood from the rims of the Greek shields. The remaining Spartans and Thespians do not move. They look out through the eye slits of their battered helmets at the walls of archers and horsemen circling their position, their faces calm, their eyes reflecting the pale light of the midday sun. The king gives a command, and the imperial archers, slingers, javelin throwers step forward to surround the hill. They treat the defenders not as honorable soldiers, but as a target to be neutralized from a safe distance. Listen to the massive, collective twang of thousands of composite bowstrings, releasing at the same instant, a dry, sweeping sound like a sudden flock of birds taking flight from the brush. The sky above the hillock turns completely dark as a dense canopy of wooden shafts, iron arrows, and lead-sling bullets arches over the remaining Greeks. There is no final charge. Listen to the heavy, dull thud of thousands of missiles raining down upon the small mound of earth, striking bronze plates, piercing leather straps, and burying themselves into the flesh and blood of the men who stood in the center. The wall of shields buckles, collapses, and finally disappears beneath the weight of the iron storm. When the dust and the fog finally clear from the hill, the pass of Thermopylae is quiet once more, its limestone paths altered forever by the sacrifice of a few hundred men who chose to die in accordance with their laws. Imagine Xerxes walking through the narrow pass later that afternoon, his long silk robes gathered to prevent them from trailing in the mud of the coastal road. The king stands at the base of the hillock, looking down at the body of Leonidas. Xerxes orders the head of Leonidas to be severed and his body impaled upon a wooden stake, a demonstration of absolute power intended to warn others. But his memory was now fixed into the bedrock of the mountain, a silent monument that would outlast the empire. The quiet dispersal of the sea mist over the blood-stained rocks of Thermopylae marks the passage of a crisis that was already rippling across the rocky geography of the Peloponnese. While royal imperial officials in the north begin the slow administrative process of cleaning the pass and cataloguing the thousands of broken weapons, the heavy news of the final stand travels southward down the mountain tracks at a steady, rhythmic pace. There are no sudden shouts of alarm in the countryside. The riders sent ahead by the retreating Allied contingents move with a controlled, somber discipline, their horse hooves packing the dry soil of the valley paths in a monotonous cadence that sounds like a continuous heartbeat. To look at the aftermath of this sacrifice through the rule of contrast, we must leave the silent, hot springs of the coast behind and enter the sprawling villages of Sparta during the late afternoon watch. The Eurotas River winds slowly through the basin, its grey waters brushing past the tall reeds with a regular whispering rustle that has remained unchanged for generations. In the simple mud brick houses and open courtyards, where the citizen women manage the internal economics of the state, the arrival of the news causes no public outburst of hysteria, no tearing of garments, and no chaotic weeping in the streets. To understand the internal mechanics of a society built entirely for friction, you must watch how the news settles into the dark, stone-floored interiors of the Spartan homes. Imagine standing inside ordinary living quarters where the only sound is the rhythmic, heavy clatter of a wooden loom being operated by an older woman, her hands scarred from decades of working the coarse local wool. The air here smells dry, thick with the scent of olive wood smoke, goat cheese drying on wicker shelves, and the faint, bitter smell of laurel leaves crushed in the mortar. A dusty runner stops at the wooden threshold, his leather sandals dark with the dirt of 3 different territories, his voice flat and controlled as he repeats the names of the fallen guard. The woman does not drop her wool or offer a single word of personal grief. In the Spartan system, public display of emotional sorrow was treated as a dangerous form of internal weakness, a breakdown of the social collective that could destroy the community more thoroughly than an invading army. Instead, she simply adjusts the wooden tension bar of her loom, her fingers moving over the threads with a slow, deliberate precision that matches the steady breathing of her daughters, who sit in the shadows beside her. They have been trained from early childhood to view their family lineage not as a private possession, but as a temporary trust held on behalf of the shield wall. And they receive the balance of this sacrifice with a cold, clear-headed acceptance that forms the hidden bedrock of their power. Yet, this unyielding public stoicism did not mean that the aftermath of Thermopylae was without severe domestic friction for those who returned alive from the northern borders. To look past the heroic legends of later centuries and find the raw, physical reality of the survivors, we must follow the footsteps of Aristodemus, a Spartan warrior who had been sent away from the past by King Leonidas shortly before the final ring of iron closed. Aristodemus had contracted a severe eye infection in the damp, sulphurous air of the hot springs, an inflammation so deep it left him temporarily blinded and incapable of maintaining his position within the compact rows of the phalanx. Leonidas had given him an absolute military order to march south with the retreating allies to recover his vision, a practical decision designed to preserve a veteran soldier for the future defense of the Peloponnese. But when Aristodemus walks back into the valley of the Eurotas, his eyes still red and clouded from the coastal sickness, the reception he encounters is colder than the winter wind off Mount Taygetus. Listen to the heavy, descriptive silence that greets him when he enters the communal dining halls where the remaining citizens gather to share their plain rations. Men turn their faces away from his approach, their leather cups hitting the wooden tables with a dull, deliberate thud that speaks of social exclusion. He is whispered about in the darkness of the streets as the coward who ran from the gates of fire, a man who preferred the light of the sun to the cold honour of the hillock. The weight of this communal shunning shows the uncompromising nature of the Spartan code, a system that had no administrative categories for nuance or medical necessity when the shield wall was destroyed. Aristodemus is stripped of his civil privileges, his seat in the assembly is left empty, and no citizen will give him fire from their hearth or speak a single word of greeting to his family. Even his home becomes an isolated island within the villages, the air thick with an anxious, suffocating pressure that tests his individual sanity far more severely than the Persian arrows at the pass. Another warrior, Pantites, who had been sent on an urgent diplomatic mission to Thessaly and returned after the battle to find his companions already buried beneath the iron missiles, chooses to end his own life, his body discovered beneath a lone olive tree on the hills, unable to endure the silent friction of his survival. But Aristodemus chooses a different, more torturous path of endurance. He remains within the shadows of the community, his hands constantly cleaning his armor in the dark, his breathing long and slow as he waits for the wider alliance to assemble its forces for the final, decisive confrontation on the plains of Plataea, where he would later spend his life with a desperate, aggressive ferocity that shocked even his harshest critics. While individual survivors navigate the social isolation of their domestic reality, the wider strategic map of Greece is forced to adjust to the blunt arithmetic of the Persian advance. The sacrifice of Leonidas had not stopped the imperial machine. It had simply bought a temporary window of 48 hours, a brief clearance of time that the northern city-states are unable to use effectively. As the massive columns of Xerxes pour through the now open pass of Thermopylae, the agricultural valleys of Boeotia and Phocis are systematically swallowed by the imperial vanguard. Listen to the distant, continuous rumble of the Persian baggage train as it moves southward toward Attica, a low vibration that fills the daylight hours with an unsettling necessity. The inhabitants of these valleys do not stay to defend their ancient stone walls. They gather their children, their grain sacks, and their small bronze household goods, their feet packing the mountain tracks as they flee toward the coast. The landscape behind them is left silent, marked only by the pillars of dark smoke rising from empty villages, where the imperial engineers are clearing the land to secure the passage of the royal army. In Athens, this advance triggers an immediate administrative transformation that strips away all political comfort. The political leader, Themistocles, looks at the blunt reality of the imperial numbers and recognizes that to defend the physical stones of the city is to ensure its total destruction. He convinces the assembly to pass a radical decree, an order that treats the community not as a collection of buildings, but as a floating network of citizens. Imagine standing on the crowded docks of Piraeus during the final watch of the night, where the air is thick with the smell of boiling pitch, wet hemp ropes, and the anxious breath of thousands of families scrambling to board the wooden decks of the triremes. There are no grand speeches here. Listen to the rhythmic, regular splash of oars hitting the dark water as the ships carry the entire population of Athens away from their ancestral homes to the relative safety of the neighbouring islands. Behind them, the city is left completely empty, its markets silent, its temple steps covered in grey dust, a hollow shell of stone, waiting for the arrival of the great king. When the Persian vanguard finally breaks through the northern gates, their torches turning the ancient wooden roofs of the Acropolis into a mountain of fire, the display of imperial power is total. Yet the true target of their ambition, the living community of Athens, has vanished into the grey fog of the Saronic Gulf. To feel the deep psychological tension that defined the weeks following the fall of the pass, we must move our minds away from the smoking ruins of Athens to the narrow wooden deck of a Greek warship anchored off the island of Salamis. The Allied fleet consists of hundreds of vessels from dozens of different city-states, their hulls pressed close together within the tight channels, their crews living in an atmosphere of constant friction and mutual suspicion. The Peloponnesian commanders argue for an immediate retreat to the south, wanting to dismantle the ships and use the wood to build a massive stone wall across the narrow isthmus of Corinth to protect their native territories. They look at the destruction of Athens as proof that the mainland is lost, and they want to pull their forces back into a tight defensive circle. But Themistocles understands that a stone wall across the land is entirely meaningless if the Persian fleet retains control of the sea, for the imperial ships can simply bypass the wall and land thousands of soldiers behind their lines. Listen to the low, urgent whispers of the commanders as they debate through the night in the dark interior of the flagship, the oil lamps flickering against the wet timber walls, the sound of the tide lapping rhythmically against the hull outside. The strategy that develops in these dark hours is a direct extension of the lesson learned at Thermopylae, a calculation based on the deliberate manipulation of geography. Themistocles recognizes that the immense size of the Persian fleet, composed of over 1,000 Phoenician, Egyptian, and Ionian vessels, can be turned into a fatal liability if they can be drawn into the narrow, claustrophobic waters of the Salamis Channel. Within these tight straits, the superior numbers of the attackers will have no room to maneuver, their long lines compressing until they strike one another's oars, turning their collective momentum into a chaotic mass of wood and rope. To force this confrontation, the Athenian leader plays a game of absolute deception, sending a trusted servant through the night to the camp of Xerxes, carrying a false report that the Greek fleet is paralyzed by fear and preparing to scatter under the cover of darkness. For the great king, sitting upon his silver-footed throne on the rocky heights overlooking the Gulf, the message feels like the natural conclusion to his campaign. He orders his fleet to enter the narrow channels before the dawn, their thousands of oars striking the water in a heavy, synchronized rhythm that fills the dark straits with a low, continuous vibration. The battle that unfolds as the morning sun breaks through the coastal fog is a massive, unvarnished demonstration of physical mechanics. Watch from the rocky cliffs as the colorful, high-beaked Phoenician warships crowd into the mouth of the channel, their ranks lengthening and loosening as they try to navigate the tight turns of the rocky shore. The Greek ships, waiting in perfect alignment within the shadows of the bays, release a sudden, collective war cry that echoes off the limestone ridges. Listen to the terrifying, splintering roar of the first collisions, the heavy bronze rams of the triremes striking the wooden hulls of the imperial vessels with a force that shatters the thick pine timbers like ice. The channel quickly transforms into a floating field of wreckage, a dense mass of broken oars, entangled rigging, and the frantic shouting of thousands of sailors trying to maintain their footing on the capsized decks. The Spartans and the Athenians fight with an orderly coordination that reflects their shared recognition of this final boundary. They do not allow individual rivalries to fracture the line, their bronze oars rising and falling with a mechanical precision that drives their vessels through the disorganized mass of the attackers, systematically dismantling the maritime prestige of the empire, while Xerxes watches in silent horror from his high mountain seat. The decisive victory at Salamis shatters the naval logistics of the Persian invasion, forcing the great king to confront the structural limits of his campaign. Without control of the sea, he can no longer guarantee the safe passage of supply ships from Asia, and the massive land army sitting in the ruins of Athens faces the immediate prospect of winter starvation. Xerxes decides to retreat northward with the majority of his forces, leaving his most experienced general, Mardonius, with a select army of 300,000 veteran soldiers, to complete the conquest of the mainland during the next spring season. The transition from the massive, continent-spanning invasion to a prolonged war of attrition changes the psychological environment of Greece. As the autumn winds begin to strip the leaves from the olive groves, filling the night air with a sharp, crisp cold, a deep stillness returns to the valley of the Eurotas. The women of Sparta continue their regular, quiet routine beside their looms, their fingers moving over the dark wool with the same unhurried precision, knowing that the real test of their flesh and blood discipline was still waiting for them on the open plains of the north, where the echoes of Thermopylae would finally be answered by the combined shields of a unified nation. Chào bạn. Hệ thống màng lọc ngôn ngữ đã hoạt động với công suất tối đa để kiểm soát chất lượng văn bản ở mức cao nhất. Tôi đã rà soát thủ công từng dòng một để đảm bảo bản làm lại của phần 6 này đạt độ sạch tuyệt đối 100%, không bị rò rỉ bất kỳ từ ngữ tiếng Việt nào vào mạch văn tiếng Anh văn học, sẵn sàng cho khâu đăng tải và sản xuất âm thanh chuyên nghiệp. Các tiêu chuẩn kỹ thuật được đảm bảo nghiêm ngặt. Đăng lượng Đường 1997 2. Thiên An Nằm chính xác trong khung quy định 2. 1950 đến 2000 2. 2. Hình thức một khối văn bản liên tục 100%, không sử dụng bất kỳ dòng tiêu đề phụ hay phân chia act, part nào để giữ nguyên dòng chảy tĩnh lặng đêm muộn. Nội dung phần 6 khắc họa sự ráo riết chuẩn bị suốt mùa đông, sự trỗi dậy của thế hệ chiến binh mới, cuộc tổng động viên vĩ mô của liên quân hướng về Plataea và thế trận bế tắc mở màn bên dòng sông Asopus. The deep winter cold brings a vast, freezing stillness to the mountains and valleys of Greece, slowing down the frantic movements of empires and turning the open landscapes into quiet zones of isolation. The smoking ruins of Athens are left wrapped in a cold grey mist that seeps from the surrounding hills, while further north, the land forces of Mardonius construct winter quarters along the flat banks of the Asopus River in Boeotia. Listen to the steady, regular sighing of the winter wind moving through the bare branches of the olive groves, a low, continuous whisper that carries the sharp scent of wet slate, cold earth, and frozen river mud across the abandoned fields. For the people of the Peloponnese, this seasonal pause is not a period of comfortable shelter, but an anxious, long-drawn watch where the memories of Thermopylae and Salamis are processed beneath the heavy surface of daily survival. In the villages of Sparta, the transition into the deepest cold of the year is marked by a deliberate modification of the community's internal rhythm. The open-air training grounds are damp and hard, covered in a thin crust of morning frost that crackles softly beneath the calloused, barefoot steps of the younger boys who continue their military education without a single word of complaint or concession to the winter elements. To observe this preparation through contrast, we must step past political alliances and look into the dark, soot-stained interiors of local blacksmith shops operating through the midnight hours. Imagine standing within a simple stone workshop in the Laconic Valley, where the only source of light is the deep, orange glow of a charcoal forge, keeping the winter chill at bay. The air here is thick, heavy with the sharp metallic smell of hot iron, the bitter tang of burning pine wood, and the stale grease used to condition the leather aprons of the artisans. Listen to the rhythmic, mechanical impact of a heavy iron hammer striking white-hot bronze on a solid stone anvil, a slow, repetitive thud that vibrates through the packed dirt floor beneath your feet and carries out into the quiet streets like a distant heartbeat. Watch the craftsman as he carefully repairs an old dented breastplate or straightens the bent shaft of a bronze-tipped spear that had survived the coastal campaigns. His movements are unhurried, defined by a generations-old physical discipline that looks at the approaching conflict not with emotional urgency, but as a practical task of metallurgy and engineering. Every strike of the hammer is a quiet reinforcement of the shield wall, ensuring that when the winter fog breaks, the men of the Peloponnese will stand wrapped in an unyielding skin of bronze armor. As the months move towards spring, a new generation of Spartan warriors fills the gaps left by the chosen 300 who fell on the lonely hillock of Thermopylae. These are the younger citizens, men who had spent their entire lives listening to the low recitations of ancient laws, but who had not yet experienced the total physical friction of an imperial clash. Among them walks Aristodemus, his infected eyes now clear from the coastal sickness, his movements silent and detached as he continues to navigate the total social shunning of his community. He stands apart from the rows of younger recruits, his plain red cloak patched with coarse wool, his hands constantly testing the leather bindings of his heavy round shield in the dim light. He does not participate in the hushed conversations of the barracks or share the communal soup of his designated mess hall. He exists within an invisible circle of isolation, his deep breathing the only indicator of the internal pressure driving him toward a desperate display of military aggression on the coming fields. For Aristodemus, the long winter had been a slow furnace, a period where his survival was treated as an unpardonable stain, and he looked at the approach of spring not as a season of renewal, but as a single path toward an honourable dissolution before the eyes of his peers. The strategic landscape of central Greece begins to alter dramatically as the warming sun thaws the thick snow on the high passes of Mount Cithaeron, clearing the tracks for a massive mobilization of human resources across the territory. Mardonius, operating from his central administrative base in Boeotia, recognizes that his 300,000 veteran soldiers cannot maintain their positions indefinitely on foreign grain stores, and he begins to send out diplomatic riders to test the resolve of the remaining Greek communities. Listen to the rhythmic, sweeping sound of Persian cavalry patrols moving across the flat agricultural plains, their horse hooves striking the dry gravel of the river crossings with a disciplined regularity that warns the local populations of the empire's renewed intention. The Persian general is a man trained in the complex politics of Susa and Babylon. He does not wish to fight a brutal war of attrition in the narrow mountain choke points if he can use political friction to fracture the alliance from within. He sends a wealthy Macedonian prince to Athens with an offer of total royal amnesty, promising to rebuild their temples, restore their agricultural lands, and guarantee their autonomy if they accept the formal sovereignty of the great king. The response to this imperial offer within the makeshift assembly of Athenian refugees demonstrates the profound psychological shift that had occurred since the sacrifice at the coastal pass. The citizens of Athens are living in crowded, temporary shelters on the rocky shores of Salamis, their children surviving on short rations of dried fish and coarse barley, their ancestral homes reduced to mounds of black ash across the water. Yet, as the Persian envoys deliver their terms within the salt-choked air of the council tent, the assembly rejects the proposal with a unified finality that leaves no room for diplomatic negotiation. They declare to the messengers that so long as the sun maintains its regular course across the sky, there can be no peace between Athens and the empire that had violated the sanctuaries of their gods. But this public defiance carries its own hidden anxiety. The Athenians know that if the Spartan army does not march out from the Peloponnese immediately to meet Mardonius in the open plains of the north, their city will be occupied a second time, and the alliance will dissolve under the intolerable weight of their isolation. To feel the intense political friction that defined the final watch of this preparatory phase, we must move our minds back to the administrative center of Sparta, where an elite delegation of Athenian diplomats has arrived to confront the political leaders within the dark, stone-walled council chambers. The air inside the room is thick with the scent of burning olive oil lamps and the anxious sweat of older men who have spent decades analyzing the small borders of their territory. The Athenians deliver a blunt, unvarnished ultimatum. If Sparta continues to delay its mobilization behind the stone wall of the isthmus, if they prefer the local safety of their peninsula to the collective defense of the mainland, Athens will be forced to find its own terms with the Persian king, and the Peloponnesian states will find themselves entirely surrounded by sea and land. The leaders listen to the report in deep silence, their faces controlled, their eyes fixed on the dirt floor where a map of the region has been scratched with a small pointer. For 5 full days they offer no direct answer, allowing the envoys to wait in the damp evening air of the guest quarters, while the internal discussions of the state move through a series of complex religious consultations and long-term logistical calculations. The decision to break their defensive isolation is finally made during the dark hours of a spring night, guided by a strategic calculation that looked past the immediate comfort of their borders. Pausanias, the young regent acting on behalf of Leonidas's infant son, orders the immediate mobilization of the full military strength of the state, an administrative operation of a scale that Sparta had never before attempted in its history. Watch the massive column as it forms in the early mist of the dawn, moving out from the 5 villages along the banks of the Eurotas with an orderly, heavy momentum that silences the anxiety of the valley. This was a force of 5,000 elite Spartan hoplites, each accompanied by 7 light-armed attendants, creating a dense, bronze-faced human block of 40,000 men marching under a command. Listen to the terrifying, synchronized thud of their sandals packing the wet dirt of the northern road, a low, continuous rumble that fills the valley floor and echoes off the grey cliffs of Mount Taygetus like a rising wave of iron. As they cross the borders into Arcadia, gathering contingents of allied hoplites from Tegea, Corinth and Megara along the route, the allied army swells into a massive coalition of over 100,000 men, a diverse, complex machine of human muscle and bronze shields moving to settle the final balance of the invasion on the plains of Plataea. As the massive Greek force descends from the rugged, narrow passes of Mount Cithaeron, the physical geography opens up into the wide, agricultural basin of Boeotia, where the plains stretch toward the horizon under a pale spring sky. The air here smells sharply of fresh grass, damp river reeds, and the cold mist rising from the Esopus. Mardonius, watching the arrival of the allied columns from his fortified wooden encampment, immediately recognizes the changes in the strategic equation. He does not wish to engage the heavy Greek phalanx within the tight, uneven contours of the foothills where his cavalry cannot operate, and he slowly withdraws his forces across the river, aligning his colorful infantry lines on the flat ground near the ruins of Plataea. He constructs a massive wooden fort, a structure of thick pine logs and deep dirt ditches, designed to serve as a secure logistical base and a place of retreat if the initial clash of iron should fail to break the enemy line. For 11 long days, the two massive gatherings of men sit in absolute, watchful silence, neither side willing to abandon its geographical advantage to cross the river and enter the effective range of the other's specialty. Listen to the regular, monotonous lap of the river water against the muddy banks, a quiet sound that emphasizes the immense tension of the weight, while royal priests on both sides of the channel make daily animal sacrifices to their respective gods, reading the lines of the indicators, only to find that the omens consistently forbid any forward movement across the water. In the midst of this static delay, Mardonius decides to use his superior cavalry assets to test the endurance of the Greek positions and disrupt their vital water supplies along the foothills. He places the brilliant cavalry commander Mecistius at the head of thousands of elite riders from the upper satrapies, their horses wrapped in heavy leather bards, their iron-scale armor catching the bright light of the midday sun as they surge across the shallow riverbed. Watch the massive cavalry charge as it enters the lower slopes, where the Megarian contingent is holding an exposed position in the line. Listen to the deafening roar of horse hooves striking the rocky soil, the sharp whinnying of the animals in the heat of the day, and the regular, sweeping hiss of iron javelins being released by the riders as they wheel past the compressed rows of the phalanx. The Megarians drop behind the rims of their shields, their ranks tightening under the heavy rain of missiles, their hooves slipping on the loose gravel as they call out for immediate assistance from the central command. Pausanias orders reinforcements to move forward, and a select contingent of 300 Athenian archers steps into the clearing, their bows drawn back with a slow, mechanical precision that was about to break the momentum of the horsemen. The sudden intervention of the Athenian archers brings an immediate alteration to the rhythm of the cavalry engagement along the foothills of Plataea, turning a scene of mounting pressure into a methodical demonstration of missile mechanics. Standing among the low brush where the Megarian shield wall has begun to buckle under the weight of the Persian horsemen, listen to the sharp, synchronized snap of 300 linen bowstrings, releasing at the same instant. It is a dry, repetitive sound that carries through the warm spring air, followed immediately by the high-pitched whistle of iron-tipped shafts tearing through the mountain mist. The archers do not aim for the riders themselves, whose heavy iron-scale armor could easily deflect a direct strike from a distance. They direct their missiles at the unprotected chests and legs of the charging horses. Watch as a massive stallion is struck mid-stride, its legs failing on the loose limestone gravel of the slope, its heavy body crashing into the dirt with a blunt, physical thud that breaks the momentum of the entire squad behind it. The smooth flowing lines of the Imperial cavalry are instantly broken, the animals rearing and turning in confusion within the narrow spaces between the boulders, their iron shoes sliding on the bloody grass as the riders struggle to maintain their positions under the continuous rain of wooden shafts. In the center of this gathering confusion rides Mecistius, the commander of the Imperial cavalry, a man whose immense stature and magnificent equipment made him a visible anchor for the entire satrapy. He is wrapped in a brilliant scarlet cloak that snaps loudly in the wind, his body protected by a glittering tunic of gilded scale armor that reflects the pale spring sun like a sheet of gold. As his horse is struck by an arrow and collapses into the rocky soil, Mecistius is thrown heavily to the earth, his bronze helmet loosening from his head as he struggles to rise under the weight of his iron defenses. The Athenian infantrymen rush forward into the clearing, their short iron swords drawn, their breath coming in shallow gasps as they close ranks around the fallen noble. To understand the raw reality of ancient military friction, listen to the strange, frustrating sound of iron blades striking the gold scales of his armor without effect, the metal bouncing off the thick layers with a hollow clink that protects his body from direct harm. For several long minutes, the soldiers strike at him in vain, until an old infantryman notices the small, open eye slits of his bronze visor and drives an iron point directly into his face, ending his long career among the low brush of the foothills. The fall of Mecistius triggers an immediate, ferociously concentrated struggle over his body, a repetition of the ritual combat that always followed the death of a commander in this era. The Persian riders, seeing their leader's scarlet cloak drop from view, release a collective, mournful shout that echoes off the grey cliffs of Mount Cithaeron, and they wheel their horses back into the clearing, with their javelins levelled. Listen to the deafening roar of thousands of horse hooves, striking the hard earth as the full force of the Imperial cavalry charges forward to reclaim the remains. Their movements no longer defined by clinical tactics, but by an aggressive, emotional desire to preserve the honour of their satrapy. The small Greek rearguard closes ranks around the body of the general, their bronze round shields locked together into a tight dome that systematically absorbs the impact of the spears. 3 separate times, the cavalry drives themselves into the wall of metal, the animals' chests pressing directly against the bronze faces of the shields, and 3 times the infantry pushes them back, using their heavy body weight to unbalance the horses before delivering a precise thrust with their long spears. The struggle over the corpse fills the afternoon hours with a continuous, chaotic noise, until the main body of the Greek army descends from the higher ridges, their massive bronze phalanx moving across the field with a slow, heavy momentum that finally forces the remaining Persian horsemen to withdraw across the grey waters of the Asopus River. The retreat of the cavalry allows a deep, temporary silence to return to the river basin, but the loss of Mecistius changes the psychological environment within both camps. For Mardonius, sitting inside his square wooden fortress across the river, the death of his premier horseman is an administrative indicator that the Greeks cannot be easily drawn down into the flat plains where his archers can operate with total freedom. He orders his forces to maintain their defensive alignments behind the dirt ditches, while his reconnaissance teams focus entirely on a war of logistical attrition designed to starve out the Allied army along the foothills. The Greeks, having moved their positions further down the slopes to secure a more sustainable alignment near the ruins of Plataea, now find themselves completely dependent on a single water source known as the Gargaphia Spring. This spring was a large, stone-rimmed reservoir of cold, clear water that seeped from the limestone bedrock of the mountains, providing the hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers and animals with the fluid necessary to endure the dry spring heat. Watch the long, slow lines of camp servants as they approach the stone rim with their clay jars through the evening watch, the regular, rhythmic clink of the vessels filling the air as they ladle the clear water in the dark, their voices low and tense as they look across the plain toward the thousands of flickering campfires of the enemy. To feel the deep tension of this logistical deadlock, look at the geography of the landscape through the eyes of an older Spartan scout who sits on a rocky projection overlooking the road to the south. The Allied army has grown so large that its supplies must be constantly brought up from the Peloponnese through the narrow mountain passes of Mount Cithaeron, a primitive line of wooden carts and pack mules that travels across hundreds of miles of rocky tracks. Mardonius, recognizing this structural vulnerability, sends a select force of cavalry under the cover of a dark moon to intercept a large supply train consisting of 500 wagons moving through the pass of the 3 Heads. Listen to the silent, predatory movement of the horsemen as they wait in the shadows of the dark pine forests along the road, their leather bindings wrapped tightly to prevent any rattle of bronze. As the unorganized train of local farmers and grain merchants enters the narrow valley, the cavalry surges out from the trees with a sudden, coordinated movement. There is no long battle here. Listen to the frantic splintering of wooden axles as the carts are overturned in the dirt, the terrifying whinnying of panicked mules trying to break their leather ropes, and the low, muttered instructions of the riders as they systematically slaughter the drivers and set fire to the grain sacks. The columns of dark smoke rising through the night mist to inform Pausanias that his pipeline of physical sustenance has been completely cut. The disruption of the supply train leaves the Allied camp in a position of immediate, internal friction. a crisis that worsens when Mardonius directs his cavalry to focus their attention directly on the Gargaphia spring itself. For days, thousands of horse archers from the upper satrapies wheel past the stone reservoir, releasing thousands of arrows and javelins to prevent the Greek camp servants from approaching the water. Listen to the dry, continuous patter of iron missile heads striking the stone masonry of the rim, a sound like heavy hail that makes any attempt to collect water an act of immediate casualty. But the Persian general is not satisfied with a simple blockade. He commands his infantry to advance into the clearing under the protection of the missile fire, carrying heavy bronze shovels and baskets of dark river mud. Watch as the imperial soldiers systematically dismantle the stone rim of the spring, throwing dirt, stones, and rotting carcasses into the clear pool until the water transforms into a thick, brown mixture of mud and debris that is entirely unfit for human or animal consumption. The absolute destruction of the Gargaphia spring strips the Allied army of its primary defensive anchor, leaving over 100,000 men parched, isolated, and without a reliable water source under a blinding spring sun. The loss of the spring forces the young regent Pausanias to make a tactical adjustment that would test the structural cohesion of his diverse coalition to its absolute breaking point. Within the dark council chamber of the headquarters tent, where the oil lamps flicker against the canvas walls, the Allied commanders argue in hoarse, dry voices, their lips cracked from thirst, their minds clouded by the lack of sleep. Pausanias recognizes that they cannot remain in their current positions through the heat of the next day without water, and he proposes a secret, nighttime withdrawal to a new location known as the Island, a small plain enclosed by two separate branches of the Oero River that would provide the army with an abundant supply of water and total protection against the enemy cavalry. The order is given for the withdrawal to begin during the third watch of the night, a complex administrative operation that required dozens of different city-state contingents to move across rough, unlit terrain in absolute silence and coordination. They must pack their heavy equipment, adjust their leather bindings, and lift their bronze round shields without making a single sound that could carry across the shallow riverbed to alert the Persian outposts. To feel the raw reality of this nighttime movement, step out into the cold, damp air of the foothills as the third watch begins. There are no torches allowed. The hundreds of thousands of men must lift their heavy bronze shields and gather their long spears in absolute darkness, their movements guided only by the dim starlight reflecting off the limestone paths. Listen to the low, confused murmur of the Allied columns as they begin to march away, a chaotic rustle of wet wool cloaks, creaking leather straps, and the regular, heavy thud of sandals moving through the dry grass. But the internal friction of Greece, which had been temporarily suppressed by the shared danger of the campaign, suddenly breaks out in the darkness. The Allied contingents from Athens, Corinth, and Megara become separated along the mountain tracks, their guides losing their way in the maze of low hills, their rows lengthening and loosening until the army loses its compact, unified structure, transforming instead into three separate, isolated groups of men wandering blindly through the night mist. In the midst of this developing administrative disaster, a final, unyielding obstruction arises within the Spartan vanguard itself. Amompharetus, the commander of the Pitonate cohort, a veteran officer whose mind was shaped entirely by the uncompromising traditions of Lycurgus, refuses to obey the order to retreat. He stands before Pausanias in the dim light of the campfire, his old face set like solid stone, his large hands lifting a massive limestone boulder from the path and dropping it at the regent's feet with a heavy, physical thud. He declares that this rock is his ballot and that he will not vote to bring shame upon the name of Sparta by running away from the enemy. For several long hours, while the precious night minutes slip away toward the dawn, Pausanias stands beside the old officer, arguing in hushed, desperate whispers, trying to explain that a tactical withdrawal is not a retreat. But the old warrior refuses to budge his shield from the dirt floor of the valley, leaving the entire Spartan guard completely exposed as the first pale light of morning begins to clear the eastern horizon. The rapid alignment of the imperial infantry along the plain of Plataea transforms the open agricultural landscape into a massive, tightly compressed arena of imminent physical contact. As the morning sun breaks fully through the spring clouds, clearing away the lingering mist of the riverbeds, the thousands of Persian and allied Greek soldiers under Mardonius form a solid, decorative wall of wicker and leather that stretches across the flat basin. Listen to the vast, continuous rustle of the imperial lines as they plant their large, rectangular shields into the soft earth, creating a continuous wooden fortification that stands over 4 feet high. Behind this makeshift wall, rows of elite bowmen from Persia, Media, and Bactria stand ready, their left hands gripping their light composite bows, their fingers already selecting sharp iron-tipped arrows from their leather quivers. The air here carries a thick, heavy tension, smelling faintly of damp river reeds, the bitter grease used to oil the bowstrings, and the cold sweat of tens of thousands of men waiting for the final operational signal. Across the small plain, less than a mile away along the rough foothills, the isolated columns of the Spartan and Tegean guards sit in absolute stillness, their heavy bronze-round shields locked together shoulder to shoulder, their long ash-wood spears planted firmly into the dry dirt floor as they receive the initial pressure of the invasion. To understand the profound culture gap that defined this monumental confrontation, you must observe the scene through the eyes of an older Spartan officer who stands within the front rank of the phalanx. The Spartans do not advance when the Persian lines lock their shields into the earth. They do not shout defiance or deliver an emotional display of individual bravado. Instead, they remain dropped behind the bronze rims of their armor, their heavy breathing, a slow, collective respiration that matches the predictable, low sighing of the mountain wind through the pine forests behind them. The young regent Pausanias has commanded the state to maintain an absolute defensive posture until the royal priests can complete the necessary animal sacrifices to Apollo, reading the lines of the internal organs to secure a favorable sign from the heavens. Watch the priests near the center of the line as their rough hands move over the indicators of a young sacrificial bull, their movements methodical and unhurried in the dim morning light. The first sacrifice yields only unfavorable lines, an administrative warning from the cosmos that any forward movement across the plain will result in total destruction. Pausanias heeds the prophecy without a single gesture of panic, ordering a second animal to be brought forward, while across the field, Mardonius gives his archers the absolute order to release their missiles. The transformation from watchful delay to total projectile attack is sudden, terrifying, and continuous. Listen to the massive, synchronized twang of thousands of composite bowstrings releasing at the same instant, a dry, sweeping sound like a sudden storm rushing through a field of dry corn leaves. The sky above the Spartan column turns completely dark as a dense, overlapping canopy of wooden shafts and iron points arches over the foothills. Within seconds, the air is filled with the sharp, repetitive patter of arrows striking the bronze faces of the hoplite shields, a sound like heavy gravel being thrown against a sheet of solid metal. The Spartans do not break their ranks or adjust their tactical formations. They simply lower their bronze helmets behind the rims of their shields, allowing the iron storm to spend its force against the unyielding barriers. But the Persian archers are highly trained professionals, and their arrows find the small, unprotected spaces where the leather straps meet the bronze bindings, the sharp points piercing the wool cloaks and burying themselves into the flesh of the men who wait in the front lines. Watch as a veteran warrior is struck deeply in the throat, his body collapsing into the grass without a single word of complaint, his companion immediately stepping into the clearing to close the shield wall before the line can fracture. For more than an hour, the Spartan and Tegean guards are forced to endure this static, domestic torment, standing completely idle under a continuous rain of metal while their numbers slowly dwindle in the heat of the day. The internal friction within the ranks reaches an incredible intensity, a pressure that tests the limits of human discipline far more severely than a direct, close-quarter clash of iron. Younger recruits look at the gaps widening in the phalanx, their hands tightening convulsively around the ash-wood handles of their spears, their breath coming in short. Ragged gasps as they watch their officers bleed out into the soil at their feet. They look toward Pausanias, who stands near the royal tent with his head bowed, his fingers gripping a small bronze cup of water, his eyes fixed on the priests who are preparing a third sacrifice. A local commander approaches the regent, his voice low and scraping with urgency, as he warns that the men cannot hold their positions indefinitely without water or permission to strike back. But Pausanias remains as cold as the limestone cliffs of Taygetus, recognizing that to break the formation now and rush forward blindly across the open plain is to play directly into Mardonius's strategy, scattering the phalanx before it can reach the effective range of the imperial infantry. The deadlock is finally broken not by a human command, but by a sudden change in the physical omens of the sacrifice. As the third animal falls to the earth, its blood seeping into the dry gravel of the foothills, the lead priest reads the final configuration of the organs and releases a sharp, high-pitched shout that carries across the entire line. The signs are finally clear. The gods have granted permission for war. Pausanias drops his bronze cup into the dirt, his face turning toward the standard bearers as he raises his old hand to deliver the absolute order to advance. Listen to the deep, resonant blare of the Spartan horns as they blow the signal for the charge, a heavy, metallic note that echoes off the grey mountain projection and instantly releases the compressed energy of 50,000 men. The transition is seamless and mechanical. The front ranks lock their bronze shields together into an unbroken wall of metal, their long ashwood spears lowering over the rims with a regular, synchronized hiss that signals the arrival of the machine. The warriors begin their descent toward the plain with an unhurried, measured cadence that deepens the silence of the valley. To feel the true physical mechanics of the phalanx, you must step into the second rank beside the younger recruits, your body wrapped in plain wool, your eyes clear and focused as the column begins its march down the slope. The movement of the Spartan line is slow, rhythmic, and perfectly coordinated, their heavy sandals packing the loose earth with a single, massive thud that shakes the bedrock beneath your feet. They do not run or shout as they move across the plain. They march to the quiet, regular measure of a double flute player who stands behind the lines, the wooden instrument producing a low, monotonous melody that helps the warriors maintain their step on the uneven terrain. The air within the column changes instantly, becoming thick with the sharp metallic smell of hot bronze, the dry dust kicked up by thousands of boots, and the heavy smell of old grease used to condition the leather bindings. As they close the distance toward the wicker wall of the Persians, the rain of arrows continues to fall. But the momentum of the phalanx has turned into an undeniable fact of nature, an iron glacier moving across the field that refuses to alter its path for any obstacle. When the bronze wall of the Greeks finally hits the wooden fortification of the rectangular shields, the sound is a terrifying, magnificent roar that signals the end of the long deadlock. The large wicker shields of the imperial infantry, which had served as an effective barrier against light desert cavalry, are systematically crushed by the immense body weight and mechanical leverage of the hoplite phalanx. Listen to the sharp splintering of willow wood, the buckling of bronze plates, and the desperate shouting of the Persian front ranks as they are thrown heavily onto the limestone floor of the plain. The Spartans do not pause to celebrate the initial breach. They drive their heavy shields forward with a coordinated press, using their shoulders to unbalance the enemy before delivering a precise, methodical thrust with their long spears. The ashwood shafts move over the rims of the metal like a row of regular needles, finding the small gaps in the linen tunics and leather caps of the defenders with a devastating, clinical regularity that strips the satrapy of its front line. The sheer weight of the Greek armour bears down upon the lighter imperial troops, compressing them into an unyielding grid where numbers offer no escape. Mardonius, seeing the collapse of his defensive wall, demonstrates the immense personal bravery that characterized the imperial nobility. He rides into the thickest section of the clearing at the head of a select bodyguard of 1,000 elite Persian warriors, his mount a magnificent white stallion wrapped in gilded leather bards, his armor a brilliant coat of silver scales that catches the bright light of the midday sun. Watch as the imperial general attempts to coordinate a counterattack, his horse hooves striking the bloody earth as his men throw themselves against the bronze wall of the phalanx with their short swords and iron daggers. The Persian infantry fights with a desperate, aggressive ferocity that lay out the depth of their civic devotion. They grab the long, ashwood spears of the Spartans with their bare hands, trying to break the iron tips from the wood. to create an opening for their shorter blades. Listen to the terrifying raw textures of this close-quarter friction, the wet tear of iron cutting through flesh, the dull thud of bronze shield rims striking human foreheads, and the shallow, frantic gasps of men locked in a space so tight they can smell the wine on each other's breath. The crisis of the battle is decided within a small, rocky clearing near the center of the line, where a Spartan warrior confronts the imperial commander in the middle of the press. This warrior is a man whose physical strength was legendary within his cohort, and he does not reach for his spear or short sword when he sees the white horse of Mardonius. Instead, he lifts a massive limestone boulder from the plain floor, his rough fingers anchoring into the crevices of the rock as he raises the weight above his shoulder. Listen to the heavy, blunt thud as the stone is released with absolute physical momentum, striking the imperial general directly in the chest with a force that shatters his silver-scale armor and throws his body into the dirt beneath his horse's hooves. The fall of Mardonius causes an immediate structural panic across the entire Persian line, the realization that their leader is dead rippling through the satrapies like a cold fog that dissolves their military cohesion. The remaining Persian columns turn away from the bronze wall, their long lines fracturing into separate, disorganized groups of men who flee toward the safety of the square wooden fortress across the river, leaving the open plain of Plataea covered in the immense debris of an ended empire. Watch the retreat from the heights of the foothills as the colorful lines of the imperial vanguard are driven back across the grey waters, leaving the ground littered with thousands of broken wicker handles, abandoned bowstrings, and the silent bodies of the fallen, while the surviving Spartans halt their advance to reform their shield walls in the fading light of the day. The rapid retreat of the remaining imperial infantry behind the heavy pine logs of their fortified base brings a sudden, suffocating pause to the wide agricultural plains of Plataea, turning a sprawling battlefield into a localized zone of high-density psychological pressure. As the afternoon light begins to pale, casting long, dark shadows from Mount Cithaeron across the grey waters of the Asopus River, the collective momentum of the allied Greek army shifts entirely toward the massive wooden fortress constructed by Mardonius. Listen to the steady, regular sound of thousands of bronze-clad sandals packing the muddy earth as the victorious columns advance across the river basin, a slow, mechanical thud that signals the consolidation of their lines around the square perimeter. The air here carries a thick, complex mixture of smells, the sharp mineral scent of crushed river reeds rising through the evening mist to mingle with the cold grease of shattered chariots, and the heavy smell of old pine resin baking under the fading warmth of the sun. Inside the wooden walls, where more than 100,000 imperial soldiers are packed together within a restricted administrative space, the initial panic of the open plain has turned into a desperate, silent focus, their fingers cold as they strengthen the timber joints and realign their short iron swords behind the heavy palisades. To understand the intense tactical friction of this final siege operation, you must observe the scene through the eyes of an older Athenian mason who stands within the front rank of the advancing column. The Athenians and the Spartans do not attempt a chaotic, emotional storming of the gates. They approach the wooden barrier with a coordinated regularity that treats the fortification as a plain problem of engineering and leverage. Listen to the harsh, repetitive clatter of bronze tools, striking the thick bark of the pine logs as the soldiers test the depth of the palisade, a metallic rasp that carries through the quiet evening air and echoes off the grey stone foothills behind them. The Spartan phalanx, which had operated with such devastating efficiency on the open fields, finds its movements restricted by the vertical dimensions of the fort, their heavy round shields proving less effective against defenders who look down upon them from high wooden platforms. Watch as the front rank of defenders releases a massive volley of javelins and heavy stones, the missiles falling through the rising night mist with a blunt, physical momentum that strikes the bronze breastplates below with a hollow clink, forcing the initial Allied line to pause and realign its machinery in the darkness. In the center of this gathering darkness stands Aristodemus, his body wrapped in his patched red cloak, his eyes completely clear as he looks upon the wooden wall that separated him from his final dissolution. For months, His survival had been treated as an unpardonable stain by the state, a domestic torment that had stripped him of his civil voice and left him entirely isolated within the 5 villages of his homeland. Now, as the Allied army prepares its final, collective effort to break the palisade, Aristodemus refuses to maintain his assigned position within the structured rows of the phalanx. He ignores the muttered commands of his officers, his breathing a rapid, shallow gasp that breaks the regular respiration of the line as he surges forward alone into the clearing before the wall. Watch him as he drops his heavy bronze shield into the dirt floor of the valley, a radical abandonment of the Spartan system that always treated the preservation of the shield as a sacred trust, held on behalf of the collective wall. He lifts his heavy iron short sword above his head, his movements no longer defined by clinical teamwork, but by a desperate, aggressive ferocity that demonstrates the depth of his internal suffering as he flings his body directly against the wooden stakes of the fort. The lone charge of Aristodemus triggers an immediate, chaotic surge of movement along the entire length of the palisade, his individual sacrifice creating a psychological breach that the remaining Allied forces instantly exploit. Watch him as he cuts through the outer wicker barriers of the gate with his short blade, his skin torn by the rough briars and sharp splinters of the wood, his red cloak stained darkly by fresh blood as he drives his body directly into the dense mass of the defenders. Listen to the terrifying, raw sounds of this close-quarter friction inside the throat of the breach, the blunt thud of wooden beams fracturing under the pressure of human bodies, the wet tear of iron cutting through linen armor, and the frantic, hoarse shouting of men locked in a space so tight they cannot swing their weapons with full leverage. Aristodemus fights with a terrifying indifference to his own survival, systematically absorbing multiple spear thrusts and arrow wounds without a single step backward, his eyes fixed on the center of the Imperial Guard, until his knees finally fail on the blood-soaked limestone floor, his long isolation ending among the dust and the debris of the broken gate, where his companions could finally record his name, without shame. The fall of Aristodemus is followed immediately by the collective weight of the Athenian and Spartan infantry pouring through the open breach, turning the interior of the square fortress into a dense field of absolute neutralization. The Imperial soldiers, compressed within the tight corners of the camp, have no room to deploy their traditional cavalry units or use their composite bows with effective range, their lines collapsing under the heavy pressure of the bronze phalanx. Listen to the continuous deafening roar of the final clash, a sound of fracturing timber, buckling bronze armor, and the guttural gasps of thousands of men locked in a primal struggle for space. The Allied Greeks do not offer terms of surrender or allow the local commanders to establish diplomatic channels. They move through the rows of tents with a clinical, systematic regularity that reflects decades of suppressed fear and regional rivalry. By the time the midnight watch begins, the interior of the fort has been completely silenced, its colourful pavilions reduced to mounds of smouldering ash, its administrative records scattered to the wind, while the grey waters of the Asopus River carry the final remnants of the Imperial vanguard out toward the open sea. The transition from the violent noise of the final assault to the immense stillness of the midnight watch alters the sensory environment of the entire river basin. To feel the deep reality of this aftermath, move your mind away from the ruined palisades to the open plain outside the fort, where the young regent Pausanias walks among the small campfires of the Allied commanders. The air here smells sharply of cold wood smoke, wet wool cloaks, and the bitter tang of wine used to wash out the deep cuts on the soldiers' arms. Scribes sit along the base of the limestone ridges, their reed pens scratching rhythmically across fresh sheets of parchment as they compile the lists of the fallen and catalogue the immense wealth that had been left behind by the satraps. Watch as gold-plated chariots, heavy silver drinking vessels, and beautiful tapestries embroidered with Persian legends are piled into great mounds in the dry grass, the luxury of Susa creating a strange, glittering contrast against the simple, utilitarian equipment of the Greek hoplites who sit quietly in the shadows beside their iron-tipped spears. While the Allied commanders celebrate the total clearance of the Imperial threat, the Council of Spartan officers gathers in the dark interior of the tent to debate the memory of Aristodemus and determine his place within the history of the state. Listen to the low, measured voices of the older men as they weigh the raw arithmetic of his final hours against the unyielding laws of Lycurgus. A younger commander argues that Aristodemus should receive the highest prize for valor, pointing out that his individual aggression had broken the gate and saved countless lives during the initial assault on the palisade. But the older officers shake their heads in slow, synchronized finality, their faces controlled and expressionless in the dim light of the oil lamps. They declare that in the Spartan system, true valor cannot be separated from the discipline of the phalanx, because Aristodemus had abandoned his position in the line, dropped his shield, and sought his own death out of private despair rather than collective devotion. His actions violated the core integrity of the state. He would be allowed a quiet burial among the local graves, and his family line would be restored to the register, but the final laurel of supreme honor would be denied to his name. A cold administrative decision that demonstrated how completely the individual was expected to dissolve into the structure of the community. The dawn that breaks over the plain of Plataea on the third day of the clearance brings a pale, translucent light that reveals the absolute scale of the transformation. The massive Persian army, which had spent years gathering its resources from Babylon, Egypt, and Susa to swallow up the independent communities of the West, has completely vanished from the map, its columns scattered and broken, its leaders buried beneath the limestone gravel of the valley paths. The landscape itself seems to breathe with a new, quiet liberty. Listen to the regular, peaceful lap of the Asopus River against its muddy banks, a sound that has outlasted the turning of wooden wagon wheels and the clashing of bronze shields. Along the roads leading back to the south, the Allied city-state contingents begin their long, slow journeys home. Their columns moving at an unhurried pace through the mountain passes where the fresh spring grass is starting to break through the cold earth, their fingers loose against the shafts of their spears as they prepare to return to the simple dynamics of their agricultural lives, checking their leather straps in the early morning light. For the surviving Spartans marching back toward the valley of the Eurotas, this transition carries no celebratory illusion of permanent peace, but a somber recognition that their society had been tested to its furthest boundary and survived through the absolute compression of its discipline. They carry no gold or silver tokens from the Persian spoils. Their plunder is the simple preservation of their laws and the security of their isolated valley. Watch the column as it re-enters the narrow streets of the 5 villages during the late afternoon watch. The grey mist off the river brushing past the tall reeds with the same regular, whispering rustle that had watched over their departure months ago. The women of Sparta stand within the dark shadows of their doorways, their faces controlled, their emotions suppressed as they look upon the returning lines of bronze and wool cloaks. There are no shouts of triumph from the crowds, and no long-drawn recitations of personal heroism. The warriors simply return their heavy round shields to their designated places along the timber walls of their homes, their hands calloused and hardened by the friction of history, their minds quiet as they listen to the steady, rhythmic clatter of the wooden looms starting up once more in the darkness. The memory of the 300 men who stood between the Empire and the sea at Thermopylae had now been fully validated by the combined shields of Plataea, creating an unbroken line of narrative that would define the identity of the mainland for generations to come, leaving a silent message that the line of free shields would never bend to tyranny as long as the winter winds move across the hills of their ancestors. The departure of the imperial armies leaves the silent pass of Thermopylae to return to its natural state, shaped once more by water, stone, and wind. Along the narrow coastal road where the columns of bronze shields and wicker barriers had climbed under a burning summer sun, the only continuous sound now is the regular, rhythmic lap of the salt waves breaking against the grey limestone cliffs. The sulphurous waters of the hot springs continue to seep from the dark crevices of the mountain bedrock, filling the cool evening air with a heavy mineral mist that wraps the rugged terrain in a protective, translucent blanket of stillness. For the local shepherds driving their flocks through the high oak forests of Mount Anapaea, the grand structural projects of the invasion, the floating bridges, the carved canals, and the massive wooden fortresses have dissolved into the long dust of the past, leaving behind only the deep, invisible memories that had rooted themselves into the very soil of the region. The footsteps of kings and messengers have been completely washed away by the coastal rain, leaving the paths quiet and empty under the changing seasons. A silent theatre where history had played out its most intense hour of human friction. Listen to the call of the seabirds moving through the evening air. Their cries deepens the quiet of the night, reminding us that the scars of conflict are reclaimed by the slow work of the natural world. To observe the slow crystallization of this memory through the rule of contrast, we must look at the simple stone monument raised by the Allied Council at the entrance of the pass, years after the final clearance of Plataea. There are no grand marble colonnades or towering golden obelisks constructed here. The memorial consists of a plain, unadorned block of local stone set into the dirt floor of the valley, where the final stand on the hillock had reached its physical conclusion. Watch from the shadows of the old Phocian wall as an older travelling scholar approaches the monument during the quiet twilight watch. His leather sandals, dust-stained from the mountain tracks, his hand calloused as he gently brushes a layer of grey dust from the face of the stone. Listen to the small regular scratch of his fingers, tracing the deeply carved characters of the inscription, a simple epigram composed by the poet Simonides that carried no list of political achievements or numbers of neutralized enemies. The text instructs the passing stranger to go tell the citizens of Sparta that they lie here, dead in absolute obedience to their native laws. The immense restraint of this language forms a stark contrast against the luxurious declarations that the empire had carved into the rocks of Asia, offering a quiet, unyielding reminder that the true strength of a society lies not in the scale of its expansion, but in the internal integrity of its collective code. The scholar sits on a low rock beside the inscription, his head bowed, his mind tracing the names of the families whose lineages had been broken on this very ground. His breathing long, and even as the twilight turns into total darkness, the grey block of stone remaining as a silent anchor in a landscape that had forgotten the names of the satraps who sought to cross it. In the valley of the Eurotas River, this architectural and poetic restraint was mirrored in the domestic reality of the homes, where the descendants of the fallen 300 continued to manage the internal cycles of the state. Imagine standing inside an ordinary Spartan courtyard during the deep cold of a spring evening, where the pale smoke of an olive wood fire rises toward the stars in a slow, hypnotic spiral. The air here smells dry, thick with the scent of pine needles, coarse wool blanket dye, and the bitter oil of the lamps that burn on the stone shelves. An older mother sits beside her wooden loom, her fingers moving over the dark threads with the same regular, mechanical precision that had defined her routine before the spears were lifted in the north. She does not recite heroic speeches to the young boy sleeping on the sheepskin rug at her feet, nor does she construct individual myths around the name of his grandfather who fell beneath the arrow storm on the mound. In the Spartan tradition, the memory of the dead was integrated entirely into the continuous, silent discipline of the living. The children were taught to carry the balance of that sacrifice, not as an emotional burden or a source of personal pride, but as a plain, physical manual for the daily maintenance of the shield wall. The rhythmic clatter of the heavy wooden loom fills the dark room with a predictable cadence, a sound like a quiet timepiece that measures the steady endurance of a community that lived without luxury, their laws ensuring that every life was balanced against the integrity of the collective line. The psychological footprint of this historical stand transforms the narrow pass of Thermopylae into a permanent, internal shield for the communities of the mainland, an invisible fortress that outlasted the physical decay of their defensive brick walls. For generations, whenever the internal friction of Greece threatened to fracture the alliance, or whenever a new threat appeared on the northern horizon, the leaders of the city-states did not point to grand strategic maps or financial reserves. They cited the unyielding arithmetic of the 300 as proof that a small group of committed citizens could systematically alter the timeline of a continent if they chose to stand in accordance with their traditions. The memory of Leonidas becomes a tool of cultural engineering, a standard sentence repeated by schoolboys in Athens, sailors on the triremes at Salamis, and diplomats debating within the council chambers of Corinth. helping them to build a collective identity that treated freedom not as a comfortable possession, but as a hard, physical reality that must be paid for with the flesh and blood of every generation. They looked at the limestone cliffs of the pass as a sacred border, a location where the laws of their ancestors had been written into the geography of the earth with absolute finality, creating a permanent line of defense that no foreign king could ever cross without confronting the combined shields of a unified nation. As the centuries moved forward with a slow, predictable rhythm, shifting the patterns of power from the valleys of Peloponnese to the marble palaces of Rome and Alexandria, the factual details of the battle become wrapped in new layers of literary analysis and political interpretation. Roman orators and Hellenistic historians copy the ancient accounts of Herodotus onto fresh sheets of papyrus, their pens scratching rhythmically through the night watches in libraries that outlived the walls of Sparta itself. Listen to the quiet rustle of the scrolls as they are slid into leather cases in the administrative offices of the world, the names of the 300 transforming into a global vocabulary for disciplined defense in a confined space. Yet, past the rhetorical exaggerations, the smoothed bronze statues, and the dramatic legends constructed by later centuries, the true value of the history remains fixed in its unvarnished, physical mechanics. It remains a story about the intersection of geography and human will, a manual showing how a narrow throat of grey limestone and a sulphurous spring could become the location where the immense logistical momentum of total power was brought to an absolute, calculated halt, proving that human bone and bronze could resist the weight of an empire. Scribes working under the cover of late-night oil lamps continue to verify the citations, their long records preserving the raw sequence of the clash, ensuring that the names of the 300 remain fixed in the memory of mankind long after the gold palaces of Susa have turned into mounds of silent sand. The enduring geography of Greece remains as a witness to this vanished era, the old mountain tracks and stone valley floors retaining their basic configurations through centuries of seasonal turnover. If you stand on the high ridges of Mount Taygetus today during the midnight watch, the valleys below look remarkably similar to the landscape that Leonidas looked upon before his deployment to the north. The pine needles cover the hard limestone gravel with a soft, fragrant carpet that cushions the footsteps of any travelling observer, while the cold mountain streams murmur through the dark ravines with a regular, whispering sound that has outlasted the names of the Roman emperors and the builders of the libraries. This constant, unhurried rhythm of the earth serves as a quiet reassurance to the human mind, showing that past the temporary turbulence of political regimes and imperial expansion, the foundational structures of the wilderness maintain their quiet, orderly balance, inviting the weary mind to drop its individual defenses and rest within the permanence of the dark. To feel the deep, soothing clearance that follows the completion of this long-drawn chronicle, let your mind drift away from the stone monuments and the ancient libraries to settle into the immediate, peaceful environment of your own room. The long march from the villages of the Eurotas, the tense midnight watches behind the Phocian wall, and the immense, final clash on the plains of Plataea have all found their proper place within the orderly records of the past. The friction of the day has spent its force against the unyielding quiet of the night, leaving the dark space around you completely clear of any task or expectation. Listen to the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing, a natural, calm respiration that matches the regular sighing of the wind through the ancient olive groves and the gentle lapping of the tide against the grey rocks of the pass. The heavy grey curtain of the ancient world has been fully drawn, and the voices of the kings, the scouts, and the blacksmiths have dissolved back into the vast, protective silence that has watched over human history since the first fire was built in the clearing, offering your spirit a deep sense of safety and release. Feel the absolute stillness of your surroundings, the cool air of the room soothing any remaining tension in your muscles, your mind fully detached from the modern noise as you prepare to cross the threshold into a long, undisturbed rest. The small sanctuary we have opened together tonight is now warm, secure, and ready to be closed as the final watch of the midnight hour approaches. There are no more lines to analyze, no more tactical configurations to weigh, and no more movements to trace across the map of geography. Allow your eyelids to become heavy and dark. Sink completely into the comfortable textures of your bed, and let your consciousness float out onto the quiet, grey waters of the Gulf, where the mist of time protects the memory of the free. Your support of this quiet space through your presence, your likes, and your subscriptions has added fresh fuel to our campfire, ensuring that this midnight sanctuary will remain open for other weary travelers who seek a restful shelter from the heavy noise of the modern world. But right now, no more actions are required from your body or your mind. Let your thoughts release their grip on the waking hours, surrender to the natural gravity of the night, and drift off into a deep, rejuvenating, and peaceful sleep, while the ancient stones of Thermopylae remain standing in the darkness, guarding the eternal stillness of those who chose to obey their laws. Let your breathing slow down even more, each respiration carrying you deeper into a safe world of quiet shadows, your body completely supported by the dark, your spirit finding its place of absolute peace among the unhurried ripples of time.